Here we go. Welcome, folks, to our SCITT Architectures meeting on September 5th, 2023. So let's see. I was not able to attend last week. I'm looking. We didn't have any extra notes. I was going to go through issues, but was there a good conversation last week we should build on?
Well, I'll tell you what my impression is, that there's a decision point between X509 and web DIDs. Something to make need to make something mandatory, and then everything else can be optional, but as a starting point, make it mandatory. My just quick hunch is that X509 is probably a smart way to do it, because that's got more history and no one will question that decision. Going with DID webs, it sounds like there was something missing from that. I'm not an expert on it, so, but that's one of the issues. Naming products or naming feeds or something, I was thinking maybe it's just going to wind up being a link to the product page or something. I don't know, what people want to use, but it's and then also it seems to me, I just wanted to make this comment, the overall pattern of the supply chain is a lot like a pattern of any build chain, like a build. I use the same kind of build chain in the process of building stages for our data. And I know a lot of the machine learning build chains are the same. So there may be a desire to use this to provide security at each step of the build chain, meaning that it's going to want to be used really, really frequently. At least I would want to be able to use a service like this for building all of the little products, little data products along the way. Okay, that's my
basically tracking the progress, right?
Correct. Tracking the progress of the build, and also securing that it states that I built it and when and so forth. Okay. So I will shut up because I'm not that much help usually in these meetings, but I like to listen in.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I caught the DID web and or X509 as a default. I'm not sure if I captured that right.
That's what I remember from last architecture meeting. As the very last comments, it was like, okay, we've got to decide on something permanent. It looks like it's X509 or DID web, or is it DID web or web div? Anyway, those two options. And then Ori, from my memory, said, I like DID web, but there's something missing from it, and I don't even know what it is. But and so when I was thinking about it, I thought that X509 was a prudent way to go, just because no one would question it, and it's got a lot of history. But okay, that's what I remember. Bye-bye.
So we paste it again for the new folks that are here. Hank, you got your hand raised.
Yeah, also I messed up here some of my time. So I want to raise my hand to ask for opinions about the X509, because my assumption is that there's a DID web method or the DID SCITT method, whatever it will be in the end, will have the flexibility to encompass X509 with minimal overhead. And my go-to thesis has been up to this day that the DID is therefore the way to go. Now I heard Ray's summary, which is basically the opposite. So yeah, I think that has to be a consensus building process. And I want, as Antoine and Cedric are not here today, we can have a small discussion on that. I think it's a good topic. And I would like to encourage Roy, Bob, and Ori to chime in. And then eating has been suitably conducted.
I mean, my understanding, and I'll just do a quick drop and maybe for the point of the conversation is with DID web or did web, whatever. I'm trying to get the right formatting and Ori will correct me in a moment here, I'm sure. But please do. Is I thought that was the way to actually be able to abstract both. So if somebody wanted to provide did foo, that's an extension point. And then I believe one of the things we were discussing was it's up to a particular SCITT instance to decide which they would accept. The same way the analogy I was making is if I'm traveling, if I'm going to my gym, they're going to give all I need is some ID that basically just proves I paid. Who gives a shit if I'm actually the person? If I'm traveling domestically, a state driver's license for the most part works. If I'm traveling international, I need a passport. So there's different types of identities that would be allowed per submission. Does that help as a framing? Ori, I'm going to toss to you.
Yeah, so the main point on DIDs is on the issuer of the signed statement. How do you identify the issuer of the signed statement? The DIDs or X509 as a way to identify the transparency service. It's easy because you could pick one and the standard could say, hey, all transparency services recommend the transparency service be identified in this consistent way for interoperability purposes. Mm-hmm. Like there still might be contention there, but it's relatively easier problems to solve. On the issuer of signed statements, what you're trying to do is specify a way such that when the issuer creates their signed statement, they can include some aspect of their identity that they are in control of autonomously, so that they don't need to go create another identity in order to create signed statements. That's the thing you kind of want to avoid. And so the reason that DID web was recommended for that was if you're an organization that can host a JSON file on a web server on an origin that you control, then you can use that to create an identity that a transparency service might accept. So I'll accept as my registration policy could be, if you can get a JSON file onto any origin under Microsoft.com, I will let you register signed statements. I don't need to, know anything other than the fact that you have a DID that's on Microsoft.com in order to know that I'm going to accept my signed statements from you. I could have a different perspective on that, but of the DID ecosystem, DID web is the most favorable for organizations making signed statements about artifacts that they produce. And it's the lowest burden for them. And so that was why DID web showed up, in the document as it has before.
Right.
The X509 piece, I truly am not the expert on how that actually works in the real world today. Like, what's the narrative around the X509 experience for issuers of artifacts? I think unpacking that will either make it very clear that X509 should die and we're just not even going to talk about it, or we can see a path to many issuers using X509 that is equally strong as DID web. If it can't be made equally strong, then I think the recommendation should be show some preference. But if it's truly the case that we're not sure if DIDs are going to be around longer than X509, then we should make sure that issuers of signed statements can use X509. I understand how to do that mechanically. I don't understand what the real world use case experience around that is.
Around using X509?
Yeah. So, I can give you my naive, what I think it's supposed to look like, explanation, but I'm not confident enough that what I would say maps to real business X509 code signing or artifact signing experience that Docker and Microsoft and Amazon and Google all do. Like, I could describe what I think, but what I say might not actually line up with what they do, and then that will make the signed statements maybe not acceptable to the transparency service. You know, if each one of them has a little caveat around X509, then there isn't actually any benefit from X509 in terms of standardizing a way to use it to do signed statements.
On that note, I've asked Brian Krell and Cedric to write up how we envision X509 being encoded in a COSI statement, because we've got huge amounts of experience with Authenticode and in other aspects of this. The things we ran over with Notary V2 with Amazon of having to encode the intermediate chains and all the rest of it, those are patterns that we potentially want to say, hey, this is how you do it. I tend to agree with Ori of encoding X509 and DID web is probably a great start in flexibility. So I'd asked them to start doing this 3 weeks ago, so I have not followed up to find out where they are in the journey. I know the PRSS guys have already implemented COSI signing with X509, so I just have to go push on them to make it into some documents somewhere.
So in the context of the X509 signing experience, like with DID web, you have to resolve the key material from the origin that the entity controls. Right. With X509, you have to install root certificates. Is that basically the TLDR on like what the point of similarity, you know, in terms of setup work is? Correct.
The root certificate problem exists with X509 if we're going to use CA issued certificates. And until we figure out the DID web document problem and how we're going to solve that, or
well, even without public, yeah. So you said CA, you didn't say public CA. Yeah. So it's the model for X509 that we want to be supportive of is public and private certificate authority roots need to be installed prior to a transparency service accepting signed statements with X509.
Correct.
Okay.
Installed on the host for the registration, just to, because I got a little confused when you were in client and server environment.
So in order to accept signed statements that are signed with X509, the transparency service operators must install roots for public or private CAs that are in the chain from the issuer on the issuer side.
They don't necessarily have to be roots. They can be intermediates as well.
They can be intermediates. Yeah.
But basically some node to say it rolls up to this and that's what's been.
Now this gets down to, here's how you bootstrap the system, right? The bootstrap the system is CA issued certificates. And this gets us into the 300 trusted root problem of HTTPS and TLS. It's not a great way to go, and it's expensive, which is why we wanted to have the discussion of how do I migrate to DID web and pull documents from somewhere to say, this is my public key. And let's face it, by doing this, you still have a CA issued certificate somewhere for the HTTPS request to go retrieve the friggin' DID document. So
exactly, yeah.
There's still there. It's just that we don't have to maintain a secondary set of roots, which is the whole point of why we want to do this, is not have to replicate and push out trusted CA for a completely new set of scenarios.
Let me ask a different tangent question. So with the X509, so let me go back to the isolated network environments, right? Air gapped, whatever, VNetted. If I am running a SCITT instance in an isolated environment, on submission, how would I resolve a DID web if I don't have access to that endpoint from within that environment?
It's up to the SCITT server who has to validate your identity, how it works in that environment, whether it's done through, hey, I already have that root pushed in my store, or do I have to go off and retrieve it? Now, the whole point of the DID document approach is we migrate away from requiring only CA issued certificates. I go to an endpoint and it says, hey, this is my self-signed certificate or my SSH key or my blah, 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 right? Which is why we have the discussion of what do we want the discussion going forward to be. We don't want to have to implement an ASN1 parser for Python and JavaScript and a whole bunch of other things and continue to perpetuate the ASN1 nightmare we have today.
So Ray, I see your hand raised. Let me interject one question. So Roy, so we would need to have access on that SCITT instance when I submit something. If I'm trying to submit something from DID Web Ori, ori.com, then the server would need to go out to it. But if I wanted to,
not necessarily. If it's X509 certificate wrapped in a DID Web, the first thing I would expect it to do is to say, hey, do I know anything about the trust of this CA or certificate chain, right? The whole point we were dealing with Notary is that you have to embed the certificate chain so it doesn't have to do the build operation. If it finds it locally as a trusted root already, why did it have to go anywhere?
Okay,
right? And
so that's on X509, DID X509.
They could even do it for PGP, right? If I'm using it inside a network and I've replicated, here's all the AED to find everybody's certificate, which is what happens with SMON, really doesn't matter that I have a CA that I have to go out to. The question is, if it's not in the server, that's the
right, it's a new entity. It's kind of like in Windows when it says, hey, I don't know this endpoint, do you want to add it to the firewall kind of thing? And
right. Okay, Ray, I was going to before we drive too far down this road, right?
Oh, well, it's okay to interrupt, to go ahead of me whenever I got my hand raised pretty much. I just have the question, number one, first of all, I can't think of the name of the other software solution that's very similar to SCITT, that we've talked about. I just can't think of it. So tell me what it is when you get a chance. Then the question is, I thought they were using X509. Now
you're talking SigStore in this case.
SigStore, yeah.
Right. So what happens with SigStore? Isn't
it true they use X509?
Sort of.
Okay. Now wait, before you answer that too far. The methodology behind the method of putting something on the server and then checking it that they use for the Let's Encrypt, that they also had to set up a CA and for that and deal with all that. Well, they do have one. They have.
So the whole point of Let's Encrypt is to generate an encryption channel where you don't necessarily know who's at the other end.
Yeah, it sounds like this is similar.
Well, it doesn't.
Something on the server, and they go out and are we proposing that the SCITT instance would go out and verify the DID web thing that it exists on that location, and
it would have to.
It would have.
Thanks. So let's just be clear here. So with Let's Encrypt, you're saying the primary thing you're trying to do is generate an encrypted pipe. You're not asking for a strong proof that who's on the other end. Right? You're just saying I'm having an encrypted pipe. When you're doing signatures, the whole point is to know who the hell is on the other end. What SigStore was trying to do is get to free. How do you get free signing certificates? And what they ended up doing was issuing a certificate that immediately expires. And when certificates expire, the standard TLS way of validating a certificate is thrown out of the water. We throw it away. If a certificate is no longer valid, according to the IRC for TLS, is you don't trust it. It doesn't chain up to anything, which is why Authenticode adds a secure timestamp to say, hey, it was valid at this time. Ignore the fact that it's been revoked, or you can't tell whether it was ever revoked. And the way SigStore worked around this is to say, hey, we're going to do immediately one-shot certificates. And you have to know that it's a SigStore issued type of certificate, and you have to now go back and figure out using a different mechanism to whether it's trusted or not.
Yeah, so that's all of that is just cheat codes for you can't be trusted to manage your signing key, so we're going to authenticate you and give you a short-lived cert. That's just keyless signing.
Correct.
That's all that is.
And what they ended up doing, which causes our security guys to have a shudder every time I hear it, is it's backed by an email address with OIDC, and there's no way to prove that the person who submitted the request to sign actually owns the email certificate. So there's no trust on who the hell is on the other end. So the claim is so weak that we go, we're not interested. And to be fair, it diverges from TLS patterns in what is written for X5 and 9 of how you validate a certificate, which is why the whole point of why we did the counter signature and tried to keep everything flowing as if it was X5 and 9. The receipt is still time valid, and if it's not, you can ask for a refresh receipt, and it always falls into the standard pattern written in the RFC of how to validate that identity.
Okay, quick question. Doesn't did web have the same problem with expiring certificates? If the did web document is gone, then what happens?
Well, that was exactly the conversation you and I and Ori were having the last hackathon, which is my thought was that the request to go get the DID document would get the whole document, and it would have the chain of what keys you've used from time immemorial, so you know what all the key material this person used. And part of the document could be, I revoke this friggin' certificate. And that was the case where things went really south and you had a compromise. The normal case is you just roll the certificate.
If it's gone completely, I mean, it's not there. And we have this piece of crud.
Yeah, but that's the problem. The problem here is the fact that it was used by you or somebody that compromised your machine was kind of interesting for us to encode in the document versus this was never ours to begin with. And I agree with you. The education I had from Ori is that when you ask for the document, you don't get the full document, which kind of blew a hole in my thought process of how this would work. If the fact that the SCITT service went and retrieved the whole document and said, hey, this was your signature, the only one it would validate as the current valid one is the latest one. It's the person that's looking for previous claims or evidence of what you signed 2 years ago that wants to know, was this ever truly your identity?
Yeah, in other words, it's like an address. You could buy a house at the address and you could get a document that's signed from that address. And then someone else could buy that house and you could get another document that's signed by that address. The address
documents would be unique at the same address. Like, in other words,
the documents both have the issuer that's your physical address, but it doesn't tell you anything about who owns the house at this point. And that's true of all location-specific identifiers that have some revenue model attached to them, because people don't pay to keep an identifier forever. And at some point, someone else is going to come buy it. In the case of buying a web origin, not only does that give you control over signatures originating from that web origin, it also gives you control over all email accounts on that web origin ever. So the fact that you can buy a new domain makes relying on email problematic for a lot of origins. And it also makes relying on the origin as the trust root problematic for some of them, unless you have some notary system that says, hey, you know, this guy owned this address at this time, he signed this document. And that's what the notary is doing. And then another guy could have the same address, could come to that notary or different notary and say, hey, you know, I'm a different guy, but I have the same address and I'm signing this other document.
And they're time-stamped. Sorry, time-stamped.
Yeah, you need time because of the address being potentially owned by everyone who has enough money to buy it over the entire lifetime of the universe.
So Hank, I know you're chiming in here. The last thing here is the difference between Authenticode and what we're proposing with the notary is Authenticode is premised on the fact that you have a secure timestamp encoded in your signature, but there's no statement that signature was ever valid at the time you generated the embedded signature, the timestamp. Whereas the ledger and the SCITT approach is you hand the identity, it generates a counter signature, and the fact that it's signing that, you can trust the time it's in it. And that's how we're making it better than it was for Authenticode. Hank.
Yeah, hi. So a train of thought here to that. So first of all, I have to agree, I think, maybe switch on my camera. I have to agree, I think, on the notion that you trust transparency services to handle the resolving the DID identifier, the de-identifier, and then validate acquirable identity documents. That is a task that has been to be conducted at a certain time whenever something is issued, basically, registered, sorry, at the transparency service. It has to resolve it, validate identity document, get secure time, and bake that into the outcome.
The counter signature.
For example, yes, but also, yeah, wherever the timestamp goes. So at least, of course, in the receipt, maybe somewhere else. And so that of course is a unfounded trust. So sometimes
Which is sorry, Hank, which is the unfounded trust?
That the transparency is trustworthy. That is where rats will kick in later. We are today building the resolution mechanics and all the legwork, and later on we will have to check, for example, if the resolver on the other end, where you get the identity document, which could be an XFNF, for example, that is doing also the thing that is intended. It could just give you fake identity documents, right? So that would be bad. So the first trust assumption is that the transparency server is doing everything as intended to do and nothing else. And the second after that is that the resolver you have to turn to get the identity document is doing exactly what is intended to do and nothing else. So these two items are believed to be true for now and will be supported by corresponding remote attestation results, for example, later. So, but that's the next phase, I want to say. So the mechanism has to come first and has to be logistically viable so that all the things interact appropriately with each other, and the validation of identity document works to everybody's understanding and will to implement, what I want to say. And then we can augment some of these trust assumptions with remote attestation. Having said that, and that's my second line of thought, that's why this is a train, as this is a second car, I feel like the transparency service becomes your new singular trusted entity. You might, procedural-wise, or from the customer's point of view, at some point think, oh, I don't have to trust all the issues now. I just trust the transparency servers to do it all like I would like it to do it, and just trust that one. So that is like a delegation of trust management. Of course, that's simpler for people who would use a transparency service. I'm not actually sure if that's the intent. So in the end, you should trust all the issuers to somehow. But it feels to me that we are offloading that trust decision to the registration policies, for example, of a trust service, transparency service. And I don't know if it's intentional or unavoidable or okay, but I wanted to, that's why I'm bringing up my second car here. I feel like there is a delegation happening here then.
Is that a bad thing though? If there's a,
I don't know.
Because you would have both. So for instance, if, I'm just gonna pick on Ori again here. So if Ori's got a SCITT instance that he's running, and he's got, and we're all submitting various identity types or various identity types, or even various identities from the same type, he can choose which he will validate. And I'm personalizing Ori as a service now. That if he decides to validate all except one, I'll just pick on one that gets excluded, he countersigns that. There's another service that's trying to get information from Ori's SCITT instance, and it can either trust Ori's countersignature, and if it wants to delegate deeper, it could see that, oh, it was signed by Roy, and it has a choice, or signed by Microsoft, or signed by Fu. So you basically get all of them.
The distinction here is what we're proposing is you can ask for proof that the evidence that the identity was validated from the ledger is the distinction here. We're not just blindly signing it saying, hey, we did it and you have to trust us. It's more, we did it and here we have the evidence if you ask us for it. And that gets into this audit scenario. And that's why SCITT makes a slightly different bar going forward. You're right, Hank, this gets into a delegation scenario where most people are going to say, hey, I look at the store and there's a green check mark beside it, so therefore I trust the store did the right thing and validated. Those sorts of delegations and human behaviors are things that we're going to have to be very clear and consistent on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. As long as we're aware that this might be used this way, it's fine. You can have more due diligence, but I will yield the floor to Ray.
The reason it becomes important here is I don't want small little IoT devices or ICs that have to know all the trusted routes that are configured on the SCITT instance, because that is a huge amount of traffic to gain not much.
You want to defer to the SCITT instance that it did its job until you decide it didn't do its job right, and then you either eliminate it altogether, you eliminate it as of a certain date.
Well, yeah, this is where rats make sure that the machine is running consistently, and here's the evidence, and you do consistency proof capability, and then you do the, hey, how often does a full deep audit go to make sure that it did do the right thing is important, right?
Question, just an idea. What is wrong with just doing this, having SCITT do a proof of possession to the submitter of the private, they provide a public key and then they go through a round and they prove that the submitter has the private key, and that's it.
But that's basically it has to maintain that, hey, it has the private key and it's configured for this instance to trust that route, right? I could be a badguy.com issuing certificates. Doesn't, because the CA is not in there, doesn't mean I'm going to trust it. The same thing happens with HTTP websites. So if you go to an FQDN and the CA issued certificate you get back for the website doesn't match at some point the FQDN I'm trying to get to, you still don't trust the damn thing, right? So there's these patterns that you still have to believe. In theory, your concept is correct. The way we're representing it is by countersigning the other signature is a way to represent that information, right?
Okay, well, I have a little bit of trouble with talking about or using rats as any kind of a solution, because it's fine and dandy what they have set up in terms of they've got a big verifier block on the diagram, but what they've done is pushed out all the verification into another block, and so it doesn't really go through the gory details of the verification problem. It just push it to another place. We could do the same thing, I guess, and say we're not going to do any verification. We're going to put it in another block. And
well, the thing is, I think what they're talking about is taking the rats information and submitting it off to the SCITT ledger anyway, or to a ledger, so you can do the audit. It's the premise of, is the machine running in a state that is verifiable, and you can.
No, I understand that part.
And that's why Hank is saying there's this bridge between them at some point we're going to have to be very clear on.
Well, basically you have to fill in the verifier block, and you have to solve that problem, which was left unsolved by the rat specification. They just put it in a box. Now we have to actually solve it and verify. And I can see your point that just verifying that the proof of possession is not going to be enough. But okay, thank you for.
But Ray, I agree with your statement. I don't know if there is just a single verifier for rats, like hardware verification of the value that it hashed and came up with. I think requires an audit by an outside party or by a secondary party. I think an audit the OSs come up, it gets back to the same thing we have with software supply chain, is there's got to be claims and auditors that go through and endorse and say, hey, I agree that this is exactly what it should be. And that's this pattern that we're trying to build up for software supply chain kind of works for the rest of them as well. this, you're right, blind attestation that, hey, I'm claiming that I'm just and right needs to be verified.
Yeah, but I can tell you from the sidelines of remote attestation is that there are two for the conveyance of this interaction specific evidence. There are two solutions, concurrent solutions. One of them is done primarily in the IETF, which is attested TLS, which could be one of the things. Intel favors the HTTPA, the HTTP attested, I'm not kidding. So there are these on two layers that can be done. ATLS is also done by ARM as an implementation prototype, and they are also heavily involved in all the other parts of the appraisal of evidence process done by the verifier. So I'm relatively confident, as long as we are, for example, looking at an ATLS candidate, that we will have all the building blocks to, first of all, do hackathons with that. And second of all, put the set up how to do the appraisal procedures as an example in the appendix, for example. I wouldn't standardize that, but we can show definitely with an internet draft and later RFC how this works and how this works with IETF building blocks. Because I think everything is there, at least in the construction side. Everything has a construction side and is being worked on. So whenever we are at the level that we want to pull rats in, I'm pretty confident there will be proof of concepts for the single building blocks in combination. And we can just, in air quote, just pull that in and try that. And maybe they will find gaps and add something to it. I don't know, but you're correct. The RETS architecture, the verifier is on purpose a black box, and the appraisal procedure was out of scope. But I definitely know that the reference integrity manifest work includes appraisal procedures per profile of reference integrity manifest, and therefore enables simple implementation of verifiers. And ARM is taking care of it because they really, really want that. And Intel kind of falls in line and adds a lot of, I want to say, feature requests on top, but that's okay. That is actually how it works, and I'm pretty confident that this is working out.
Okay, great. That's helpful to hear that. But the only problem is if we say, yeah, okay, we'll give it to rats and they'll verify it because they have a verifier block. Now I understand the need to keep that block kind of undefined in the rats protocol, but okay, so this is interesting. HTTP, I'll have to look into that. Is that going to provide the what we need here? I mean, is this another piece of work that's overlapping?
It fills in a hole at the bottom end. There's still discussion on how do you verify it from the outside and do it cheaply. And so there's some thoughts inside Microsoft on what we would do to represent that by Sylvan and his team. So yeah, we've kind of been focused on assume SCITT, let's get SCITT up and going. And then as we bring up rats and change bootloaders and various hardwares for confidential compute containers and how they all sit on top of rats, those all come up at the same time.
So Hank, you mentioned a little bit of rats later. Is the concept that these are continual incremental improvements and we're not blocked for them all to come together at the same time? Like, could we implement SCITT with the verifier without the rats block, to Ray's point? And then as that gets more clarified, that gets added. As HTTPA evolves and companies start implementing it, that can be added. So it's a way of doing incremental additional security.
But this is the same thing as sorry, Hank, but this is the same thing as you're getting with servers today, right? You can have your own server inside your own cloud. You can use an Azure hosted or a cloud-based container, right? And then the next step up that is to a confidential compute container to say, hey, you've done this checking, you get attestations from the hardware are all up, is even better. And then you get into how do we tie up and validate that we're in the state. Those are all better, best sort of conversation. And doesn't stop you from starting with just a plain server in your own network.
Yeah, and to come back to Steve's question, this is a incremental build up. Yes, we are effectively the trust assumption is yes, we are blissfully naive and assume everything is working fine. So we get the pipes unclogged to have an interaction model that works, and then we can well, and everybody who understands the interaction model then will see. But how can you trust that party? So yeah, see, and that's where the first evidence creation comes in. That's where the first appraisal policy of a verifier comes in. And then again, you say, but what if this entity lies? Okay, then we add another one and find appropriate building blocks. So it can be retrofitted, so to speak, at any order. As long as you have doubt about the trustworthiness from the involved parties, that tells you something, we can add it. And there's no sequence to it that's prescribed beforehand.
So Hank, would you say that I've captured this correct, this last block? Rats and HPA or incremental improvements.
Looking at the yeah, I wanna put ATLS first because that they won the race to IETF, and somehow the HTTP working group I don't think has an HTTPA ID yet. So there's at least ATLS and HTTPA. I would mention them both.
ATLS, is that what I heard?
ATLS.
ATLS.
Like the generic TLS. ATLS, exactly. So an HTTPA, that's the concurrent proposals on different layers, effectively. And I think we don't care which one is done earliest. We will look at this again when the time comes. So I will read it now. Incremental improvements that will continue. Yeah, the rats is a little bit out of order. So rats in parentheses ATLS or HTTPA, for example, are incremental improvements that will continue to improve the improvements improve. That's cool because as individual services. Yeah, you wrote that the improvements will improve the ecosystem, which is always true, I assume. As individual services can implement them via info. Yeah, okay. And we have to at some point agree what the minimal trust relationships are, and therefore select probably a reference method. But we are not there yet, so we don't have to force that decision now. Does that make sense? Sorry. It doesn't feel like it, but I'm actually pretty sick. I don't know why.
I was going to say.
I'm getting better, but this is my 4th week. Now I'm on site somewhere. I'm actually in the sun, so it's middle summer here. There's the late summer week here and the event I am at. And yeah, I just snuck out. Everybody, there's a lot of students here, a lot of young researchers, so they have sun chairs.
Okay, just a time check. So 10 minutes, about 10 minutes left. I want to try to get back to having an agenda before the meeting. So I'll start sending out notes like at least 24 hours before of here's the agenda. So I'll put a block in here for the next week, and then we can, propose agenda items. And then 24 hours before, I'll send out the current status just as a reminder, so people can decide, oh, that's an important topic, I really want to attend, or I've got something else busier and I'm okay skipping that. So just give people more time allocation. Because we do want to get back to, this is really good conversation, especially as at least for myself, trying to ramp back up after being out for a bit. And but we do want to get back to the issues, including many of the older issues that are in here. So we've got 50 issues from one of the big docs that we were capturing all the notes. So I was going to prune through these. In fact, I might, just for the sake of time, prune through these myself if there are notes. Like, for instance, this one I happen to, well, it said defers to 117. That meant IETF 117. But if there's some that are dormant and not activity, I'm going to close them out. They're still there if somebody wants to reactivate them to try to cull this back down. Whereas the pull requests, there's lots of active conversation on those. Let's see if we can continue to make progress on those. Next week I will be in the UK and it's a meeting, so I have to make sure I'll be able to attend at this time slot. So as I know more, I'll send an update. Any other items? Thoughts?
For 10
Process?
for 10 minutes, I don't know. So I agree that the issues are fossilizing at the bottom somewhere. maybe we should. So Hannes cleaned one controversial one out. There was line of
Yeah, I
thought
saw that one.
about Cozy versus Dizzy or something.
Yeah.
So he concluded that. I'm not entirely sure if that was the right time, but also, yeah, just clean it up. We can always
Actually,
revive them, as you said. Yeah.
the Cozy versus Dizzy, we pushed back to them to do the justification and said they should bring this in to the Cozy forum to make their kids. Right? It's not something should be covered in SCITT. Dizzy is not an IETF standard. So if they wanted to bring it into standards, then they should bring it into the Cozy discussion, was the way I'm pushing this.
Yeah, if you would phrase it that way, you could just reference Carsten Bormann's email on why your CEO should not select your signing algorithm. And then they think that's the answer to this question.
Yeah, which is why I thought I closed that one down already.
Did you close it with a link to that thread and asked and answered?
No, I wasn't going to be that. I did the recommendation that they cover it in Cozy working group, not in the SCITT one.
Okay.
I'm tired of us doing the mega cycles of research for them every single time. It's now, if they want to push it, then they have to do the legwork and proof.
I am going to make a suggestion that here's what I would do if I was in the situation and I was, everything was on my shoulders to get this done. I would create a document describing all the trade-offs between did web and the other options and so forth and how they work, so that I could understand it, because I can't myself capture everything in my mind at the same time, but I can usually put it in a document and then start to understand it. Unfortunately I'm not versed well enough in these topics to actually be able to do that myself. I could start it and see if people want to add to it, or maybe someone else could be in charge of being the editor. But that's what I would suggest, because normally when I'm working on stuff at this point, I have to do that, or else I'll just spin around forever and not be able to resolve it.
So it was writing up a workflow. Is that what I heard you say?
I was between did web and especially X509 and any other options that are on the table, and it's actually a really good thing to have, like later, if you say, like if you have the final standard, you can say this was our thinking about why we did this, then we can have that thinking in there. I mean, I always appreciate reading that sort of stuff, especially by the group that was originally working on making the decision of going one or the other. I agree with what I've heard here. Like getting away from ASN.1 is a very good thing to do. And it's the flow of everything going on now is to move away from that. So maybe that would be a big factor. And then just make sure that we have all of the scenarios pinned down for these issues that were brought up by Roy, like what happens when the did web document disappears, what happens when if X509 thing disappears. I mean, they're both similar. You can say, well, this one has a problem because when it's certificate disappears, then we have nothing. Well, same with did web document. If it disappears, you're in the same boat. So we'd have to have a way to do kind of what we were saying, which was at a point in time, you say this was valid at this point in time.
It's the point in time that's the important part, right? It's
yeah, and maybe, I mean, if I was just going to solve it quickly, I would just say, okay, well, look, we have this other repository which just captures all of this identity stuff. That's not the main repository. It could be, but it's not. It doesn't have the same volume or stuff. So you basically say, we're going to keep those div web things permanently there. Once you submit one, we keep it, and basically become a CA. Basically, you get to it just replaces this activity of a CA.
So we've talked about that a few times. The idea of a transparency service use case that only stores witnessed identity information for identifiers, and that potentially will host your identity information. So I gave a demo of that at the last IETF. Actually, the 2 IETFs ago, I gave a demo of that. I gave another demo of it this past IETF. But those are profiles of SCITT. It's basically how to make a did web with a transparency service. That's a thing that you can do. When I first talked to SigScore folks, I told Dan the same thing. I said, why don't you just use this to create identity infrastructure? And he was like, oh, we never thought about doing that. Then they just kept doing OpenID Connect stuff. So it remains a thing that I'm very passionate about and would love to do. But it is sort of a distraction from the core mission of SCITT, which is to get the transparency service building block right, not to go use it to solve the pain of identity.
The reason we got into
it's one of many instances.
Well, no, we got into this conversation with why we gravitated into the feeds, which is, if I want to know whether any auditor or entity has generated a claim over the lifetime of a product, and that extends past the current certificate that person's using, you now have to go off and mine the DID documents. And this is why Ori was saying, hey, this is a valid use for what SCITT feeds we give off to a store and query system, is to know how to do that. I'm interested in the DoD or the NSA auditor or the US Army auditor's claims on my product. That key could have rolled 15 times. It didn't stop the fact that our last claim was a year ago is still valid.
Well, what's wrong with that idea, Ori, that we just say we use SCITT to maintain this identity stuff that's required that would normally be kind of replacing the CA, and then we solve it with that.
If you're using the SCITT model, there's a potential for a gap, which is, hey, nothing gets submitted to the SCITT registry for 3 months, and the key could have rolled in the middle of it, and our snapshot, when we go to validate the next signed document, does not include that last month. So as long as you're saying, hey, from this perspective of the SCITT, I see all the claims assigned to that identity versus, hey, here's all the identity used by Steve Lasker, then I'm fine with that. It's, if that's the intent. I think
the point is that the identity information is sitting there. And, okay, so time's up. All right.
Yeah, so I think this is a great conversation. I think, but let's try to be cognizant of additional meetings.
No worries.
Till next week. So I'm going to send an update to this invite that includes this HackMD link, so that people don't have to guess where it is. And by all means, let's add agenda items, and we'll kind of do the agenda hacking at the beginning to make sure that we're on track for the week.
I will prod at Cedric and Antoine so we can get back to the PR.
Yeah.
I think we're close. So thanks.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye all.